Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Matarese, and before I get started with the episode today, I'd just like to take care of the usual housekeeping. For starters, paid requests are now reopened. If you're interested in submitting a disaster request, please double-check the list of requests I most recently posted to the podcast Facebook and Tumblr accounts to make sure your request has not already been made. Now, I need to post an updated list as soon as possible, but I should be getting to that next week. Also, please look through past episodes to verify I haven't already covered the disaster in question. To submit a request, you can send a donation of $30 or more to the podcast PayPal at disasteraria@mail.com, on Venmo at Disaster Area Podcast, or on Cash App at Disaster Area Pod. Just add the name of the disaster to the notes on your donation. If you have an idea for an episode subject but you're not sure if it qualifies, feel free to message me and I can approve one way or another. The subject from this particular episode was requested by Matthew and Amy, and I'd like to thank them for the request and for the donation. Now, if you'd still like to help support the podcast, you can do so with a one-time donation through PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App, or on a per-episode basis through Patreon at www.patreon.com/disasterareapodcast. A per-episode donation of even as little as $1 an episode can help me do things like pay the rent and keep the lights on. And if you do join the Patreon, you'll get new episodes ad-free as soon as I record them, rather than waiting until they are released. So if you do become a patron, I would very much appreciate it. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook at Disaster Area Podcast, on Instagram at Disaster Area Pod, and on Tumblr at Disaster Area-Podcast. Also, please think about rating and reviewing the podcast on iTunes. And as always, the sources for each new episode can be found at disasterareapodcast.wordpress.com and in the episode description wherever you might be listening to me. The sources for this episode include a documentary on the Sea Wing disaster posted by the Lake City Historical Society, an episode of Off 90 from KSMQ Public Television, and a So Minnesota story on Sea Wing victims possibly haunting the Goodhue County History Center. I also used the book Historical Disasters in Southeast Minnesota by Steve Gardiner and 2 other articles listed in the summary of the episode. Now, with all of that taken care of, thank you very much for listening, and welcome to Disaster Area. Episode 249, The Sinking of the Sea Wing, July 13th, 1890. 98 deceased. One of my favorite movies has always been Jaws. If it's showing at the drive-in or on the big screen at one of the local theaters, I am there. And every time I see it on a big screen, the orca somehow looks even smaller than it does on TV at home. 3 grown men barely look as though they can breathe comfortably on that boat, much less move around, eat, sleep, and fish for a great white shark. Oh, you definitely need a bigger boat. But then again, this isn't a pleasure cruise. It's just 3 men, and it is only for a few days at most. A lot of people are willing to hand-wave a little discomfort if they don't have to put up with it for that long. And sometimes that hand-wave can twist right back around and smack you in the face. Now, let's all whip out our maps of Minnesota. You do all have maps of Minnesota and Wisconsin, right? Because you're going to need them. So we're going to start in the Minneapolis and St. Paul metropolitan area, which sits in southeastern Minnesota with the Mississippi River winding through it. We talked about it during the episode on the bridge collapse. There is just a lot of bridges across the Mississippi River as it kind of winds through these 2 cities that are right next to one another. The river continues onward through Minnesota to the southeast, and it's not long before it reaches the town of Prescott, Wisconsin. Prescott is on its northern shore with Lake St. Croix. I didn't check to see how this was pronounced, so I apologize for anybody who's from the area, but St. Croix or St. Croix, whatever, is west. Here is where the Minnesota and Wisconsin borders meet and proceed to follow the Mississippi River until Minnesota ends and Iowa begins. This is at the point that the river just starts to follow the borders of the states down to Louisiana, I believe. Just for the record, throughout the episode, I'll be noting the state each town is mentioned is that each state that they're located in. This way you will know if the Wisconsin towns, they're on the northern shore, the Minnesota towns, they're on the southern shore. If you follow the Mississippi River this way, you'll notice a few things. For one thing, the river is dotted with multiple little islands along the way. So many of them there's so many of them that a lot of them are simply labeled island number 63 or things like that. It's just like island number this, island number that. There's just a ton of little islands. Some of them have names, some of them don't. Most of them look like they don't really have anybody on them or anything like that. There's no human habitation. They're just islands in the middle of the river. Another thing you'll notice, the whole bunch of lakes, either beside or branching off the river. So you'll see, the Mississippi River moving around, and then like to the north or the south, there'll be this kind of little inlet, and then there's a lake. But one of the lakes you can't possibly miss is Lake Pepin, about 40 miles downriver from Prescott. At first, Lake Pepin looks more like if the Mississippi River were a python who just swallowed a large goat. The river widens after you pass Red Wing, Minnesota, and it stays that way for 22 miles. It narrows back down into the river just past Pepin, a town on its northern coast where a hooked area of land juts down to cut off the lake. It is the largest lake on the entire Mississippi River. It is kind of shaped like a boomerang. It looks like it's kind of curved up and then it curves back down again, and is formed because I believe it's the Champaign River way back when, in the time that things were being, formed, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth or whatever. It kind of dumped a bunch of silt and that sort of thing at this particular point, and that backed up the river. And so now you have Lake Pepin. Given its location, Lake Pepin spent a good part of the 1800s as a freeway for lumber transport, with cut logs being pulled along to lumber mills on other parts of the river. It would also later hold the proud title of being the place where a guy named Ralph Samuelson would tie a couple of boards to his feet, hold onto a clothesline secured to his brother's motorboat, and invent water skiing in the early 1920s. I cannot attest as to how drunk either or both of them were at the time they thought this was a good idea. This sounds like something that you would do after saying, "Here, hold my beer." In any event, one of the boats which hauled lumber up and down this area of the Mississippi on a regular basis towards the end of the 19th century was a little paddle boat steamship called the Sea Wing. And when I say little, I mean little. The 109-ton Sea Wing would normally toddle along up and down the river, towing rafts of logs from one location to another, its rear paddle wheel turning to push it along. Now, when I say rafts of logs, you might picture a barge carrying stacks of logs, kind of like it's pulling along the logging truck from Final Destination 2. But a photo of the Sea Wing at work shows logs lined up like soldiers and laid flat on the water. Essentially, it really was one huge raft thrown together solely for the trip down the river to the mill. At 135 feet long, the Sea Wing was about 1.5 the distance between bases on a baseball field. It's like a good size for everyday work, but maybe not the fanciest ship for the day trips along the river, which the crew would take passengers on for a little extra cash. Now, occasionally they'd bring some people on board. It would go down the river or, somewhere and take them to go have a nice day on like a summer's day or something like that. You go out. When you go on the river, it's a little cooler. It's, nice. Maybe it's not the fanciest thing in the world, but it's just nice to get out of the heat and cool off a little bit. The boat was only 16 feet wide, and its pilot house sat a mere 22 feet above the waterline. So what you had this kind of flat-bottom boat with one lower deck, which was very close to the water. Obviously, it's a little steamship paddle boat. It's going to be low. And then you have a second level after that, and then on top of that was the pilot house, which was basically just a little shack on top. It was big enough to fit maybe 2 people inside it. It had, little windows. It looked cute, but it was basically where the captain would stand to pilot the ship. The 3-year-old boat was captained by 37-year-old David Niles Weathern, who was also a co-owner of the Sea Wing with another businessman, Mel Sparks. They're both businessmen from Diamond Bluff, which is in Wisconsin. He also owned his own general store in Diamond Bluff, which was his main source of income. According to author and historian Frederick Johnson, the Sea Wing was basically Weathern's side gig. It was kind of like his Uber gig or, his DoorDash gig. This was something that he did when, to make a little extra money on the weekends or, that sort of thing. You would just take the boat up and down the river, usually with logs, but occasionally, like I said, with a group of paying customers, with more eagerness for the job and the money, which came in than training or experience. Weathern was not a trained seaman. He wasn't one of the people that we've talked about in previous episodes who, they go into being on working on ships and working, on merchant ships from the time they're like 14, 13 or something along those lines. And they become captains by the time they're 22, 23, something like that. So he really was doing this as sort of a weekend hobby. Weathern scheduled one such trip, one of these excursions, on a Sunday in the summer of 1890, advertising that the Red Wing would stop at Trenton, which I believe was in Wisconsin. I may be wrong, so I apologize. I forgot to put down which state it was in. Red Wing, which was in Minnesota, and finally to Lake City, Minnesota, all for the low price of 50 cents, or around $17 today. July 13th, 1890 was looking to be an excellent day for an outdoor excursion on the Mississippi River, even if it was a little hot and muggy. This trip was something Captain Weathern announced for a warm and relaxing summer Sunday. It was just supposed to be something you go out, you have a good time. Maybe you are out in the heat, but you go stand in the shade, you go do something fun, something like that. The Sea Wing would depart from its base in Diamond Bluff that morning at 8:40 a.m. and load up on passengers at several stops along the river before arriving at Lake City, Minnesota. There, everyone aboard would be able to travel by carriage or by foot 2 miles to Camp Lakeview, where the 1st Regiment of Minnesota, the Minnesota National Guard, would be going through marches and firing off cannons. Now, Camp Lakeview was about 2 miles, I believe, south of Lake City, and it's right near the lake. Obviously, Camp Lakeview. They set up tents in rows, nice, neat little rows, just like any other military installation you might picture, and you can see the lake. It's actually, from the pictures that I saw, it seemed like it would have been a really nice place to visit on a day like that. You go to the campsite, you see the displays of what the National Guard are training in, and it's something to do. Because the Sea Wing wasn't exactly the most spacious boat on the river by any stretch of the imagination, a covered barge by the name of the Jim Grant had been secured to the Sea Wing with ropes near the boat on the port side to provide more space for the passengers. So if you're the captain, you're standing on top of the Sea Wing, you've got the paddle at the back, and the Jim Grant is off to your left, kind of pointing, like it's pointing downward, but it's all like it's off to, if you stuck your left arm out at an angle forward, that is right how the Jim Grant was to Captain Weathern, below him. The Jim Grant was about as fancy as you'd expect, in that it did have a roof on it, not the fanciest roof in the world. It wasn't anything grand. And it had sidewalls. So basically, those were kind of the only difference between it being the raft in the Adventures of Tom Sawyer. If you see pictures of it later on, it's just bare wood floors. There's a couple of chairs sitting around for the band that they hired that day. It is not the fanciest thing in the world, but it's very close to the water, so it would be very cooling. At least you wouldn't tip over the side and fall into the river, but that's a low bar. It's just a very, it spaces people out because there's no way you're going to fit like 200 people onto the Sea Wing. So you need a little extra space for people to spread out. On this particular day, along with 10 crew members, Captain Weathern decided to bring along his wife Nellie and 2 young sons, 11-year-old Roy and 8-year-old Pearlie. Co-owner Mel Sparks was also along as the first mate as well. So with 10 crew members, I'm assuming, Captain Weathern, first mate Sparks, and then another 8 men or 10 men, depending on how we're counting. So not only was this an excursion for everybody else on board, but also a family trip for the captain. Gets to bring along his kids, let them see what he does, that sort of a thing. At 9:30 that morning, 165 passengers waiting on the levee in Red Wing, Minnesota, spotted the Sea Wing approaching from the west. The way that it's set up, the Diamond Bluff is across the river from Red Wing, and it's kind of down from where Red Wing was. So Red Wing would be on the southern coast watching this ship come toward them with this barge hanging off it. The boat had already picked up 22 people in Trenton. The passengers waiting in Red Wing included a group of students from the Magnuson School of Sewing, who, as women, presumably appreciated the day trip, given that we're talking about a time when women needed to be accompanied by an escort, a male escort, in order to do almost anything at all. So nearly every single woman on that ship that day, and there were 57 women, nearly every single one of them had a man with them. Now, it was maybe a boyfriend, a brother, family member, something like that, but they couldn't go unless they had somebody with them. There is one story that's told in Off 90, I believe, of some descendants who are talking about their great-grandmother, something along those lines, and she was married with a daughter. And she went that day, but she did not take her husband and her daughter. She went with somebody else, or nobody really knows exactly how she was able to kind of go on this boat trip by herself without a male escort. If she went without one at all, maybe she went with a friend or a brother or somebody else. Nobody knows, but she was on this trip. Anyway, many of the passengers brought along their own picnic lunches and baskets, the kind of thing that we used to do when we were kids, and you'd go on like road trips with the family. They'd have sandwiches and a cooler in the back and some sodas, and it's that sort of thing back then. Yeah, just in preparation in case there's nothing there that, or maybe you want to save money. Some of these people were bringing, it's husbands and wives bringing, 4 or 5 kids with them. So you've got to think about that. And so it might be just cheaper to bring food with you than to go there and to spend money on any food that might be provided. Between the Sea Wing and the barge, there was enough room for everybody, but they were certainly pushing it. On the barge, Henry Reeder's 4-piece string band played for the entertainment of the passengers, one of the few things about being on the Sea Wing that day that could arguably be called an amenity. At the very least, passengers could dance along to the music on the barge's rough floorboards as it and the Sea Wing moved down the river. Lake City at the time had plenty to offer, even without the military encampment, to entertain their visitors. Hotels and restaurants, shops and cafes. You see pictures of it, and it looks like a really cute little town. But they'd also prepared ahead of time, and passengers stepping off of the Sea Wing discovered stands offering lemonade and ice cream to beat the heat. There were hamburgers being cooked. There were all sorts of things like that. At least it said hamburgers. I can't remember if they were invented or not at that time. I'm not sure. One of the people who was talking about what happened that day mentioned hamburgers, and I'm thinking, that sounds great to somebody today who, you go to a county fair or something like that, and they all have all kinds of different things that you can eat, fried crocodile bites, I think was the last thing that I ate that was really weird at a fair. Anyway, the National Guardsmen at Camp Lakeview were expecting them and were prepared to put on a show. Now, this is probably where I might make a joke about the fact that this must have seemed like lots of fun before streaming services were available, but with a band playing music, food and drink on offer, and the guardsmen eager to go through their paces, it was more than likely an entertaining show to spend the day watching with friends and family. if you've ever gone to, say, a site like Gettysburg, where sometimes they'll have those reenactments, sometimes that's a lot of fun to watch. I can remember going to Gettysburg in high school or middle school, something along those lines. And it was a lot of fun to be able to go around and see all the different sites and be talked about. You have people in, uniforms reenacting things. It was really cool. The day had been running smoothly until about 2 p.m. or so, when people started to notice dark storm clouds hanging low and approaching Lake City from a distance. It appeared as though the storm clouds were practically kissing the horizon. They took up so much of the sky. What those in Lake City didn't know at the time was that off to the west, on the edges of St. Paul, storm clouds similar to these had only just spun themselves into what would come to be known as the Lake Jervis tornado. Photos of the tornado and the ensuing devastation can be seen in KSMQ Public Television's Off 90 episode of the Sea Wing disaster. They're also in the book Historical Disasters in Southeast Minnesota, if I remember correctly. The tornado itself is photographed from Cherokee Heights, the photographer and the tornado separated by several miles of St. Paul's homes and businesses. Basically what you see is the person who's taking the photograph is on a site that is clearly up above the neighborhood ahead of it, but it's, businesses and homes and churches. You can see church spires and that sort of thing. And then off in the distance on the horizon, the tornado is dark and startling. It looks like the one from The Wizard of Oz. It is just a really, really dark gray, almost probably black in real life. It's very terrifying to see against the backdrop of a city which at the time was the home of 133,000 people. In a second photo, the remains of a neighborhood struck by the Lake Jervis tornado is full of curious people and broken trees, but not much else. Other than the fallen trees, the land is bare, with men in boulders or straw hats and women in conservative dresses striding through the debris, presumably looking for what might be left of their homes and belongings. Yet while all of this was going on, those still at the National Guard camp in Lake City, dozens of miles downriver, had no idea just how serious the storm clouds they were seeing really were, and that they just killed 6 people in St. Paul. The thing about summer is that when you see storm clouds coming, you have an expectation. You're like, okay, I need to do stuff, and I need to do this, that, and the other thing. But you're not really looking at them thinking, a lot of the time, unless you are somebody, I presume, who lives in Tornado Alley, that looks like a tornado. That looks like it's going to be bad. Like, you never really know until it shows up. Even with weather predictions and weather apps, alerts on your phone, you really can't be sure exactly what a storm is going to be like until it arrives. About a week and a half ago, we had a snowstorm in my area, and up until it was on a Friday night. It was a Thursday night into Friday. The thing is that this particular storm, for the days before that, they were saying it was only going to be a couple of inches. It was only going to be like, first it was like 2-3 inches in the valleys and like 6 inches up in the mountains. And then just as Thursday is starting, they're like, did we say a couple inches? We meant 1.5 feet. So what ended up happening is that the night of Thursday into Friday, we ended up getting about 1 foot of snow, if not more so, where I am in the valley, and up where, say, dog camp is, or, where I would have had to go if I was working that day. It dropped 1.5 feet of snow. It was just a lot of snow. And it was so bad that my full-time job on the weekend, which normally never closes, had to close because the electricity in the area was going in and out constantly. So I believe that's why they had to close the building. It was either that or they just kind of gave up on trying to keep us from coming in. They're like, no, stay home. It's too dangerous. So either way, we got to stay home. But that's the thing about, something like this. You can look at storm clouds and see that and think, oh, we're getting a little rain. Hopefully that'll cut down on the humidity. But you really can't say for sure, especially at that time, what kind of storm you're going to be getting. The Sea Wing was scheduled to leave at like 4 that afternoon. I've seen another, one of the sources that I used said 6 o'clock that they were going to leave. But the passengers pulled Captain Weathern aside. I believe I saw another source that said they pulled First Mate Sparks aside. Either way, they pulled one of the owners aside and said, and were like, hey, would it be okay if we stayed a little longer? We're having such a good time, and the soldiers are going to have a dress parade. It should be over by 7. We can stay a little longer. Can we do that? The fact that there was a storm coming their way didn't seem to bother anyone too much. Maybe it would even cut down on the humidity, like I said. Captain Weathern or Mel Sparks, whoever made this decision, said, why not? They could leave after the dress parade, which would be around 7 or so, which by that time, hopefully the storm would come and pass by, and then they could go home without having to worry about that. It wouldn't be until late afternoon when the storm finally reached Camp Lakeview. You know how summer storms can be. You see them coming, dark gray clouds moving across the sky like a creeping beast. You see them encroaching. You get enough time to bring the dog inside, close the windows, to retrieve the cushions off the porch furniture or a book you forgot on the deck. Sometimes you can see the edges of the storm approaching as a line of rain moving across the land, which is one of my favorite things about storms, when you can actually see the encroaching precipitation. Or one of the roads that I drive on to go down to Scranton is up in the hills. So it's high up, and the valley below, if it's snowing somewhere or if it's raining somewhere, you can see from a distance, and it's really neat. It's one of my favorite things. One minute you're dry, and the next a strong gust of wind pushes at your back as you race for the door to your house, just missing out on being pelted with hailstones. The excursionists at Camp Lakeview that day didn't have a house to shelter in. The excursionists, they're out in their nice dress. They've got a little parasol to keep the sun off them. You've got, like I said, men with bowler hats, straw hats. They're out doing their thing. Camp Lakeview is a National Guard settlement, after all. And it's just rows of tents, but nothing really big or solid enough to hold up well against a powerful storm. And what hit Lake City that late afternoon was powerful. The winds tore at the tents at Camp Lakeview, sending the guardsmen who were inside them running out to pound in the tent pins more securely. People took shelter in the large hospital tent, only for the tent to rise and then slap downward like those parachutes we used to play with in elementary school gym class. It also hit, obviously it hit Lake City, it hit Red Wing, it passed over these cities, and it just was causing all of this destruction. It's bringing down trees. I mean, it probably brought down, telegraph lines, power lines, like those sorts of things if they had those up. It destroyed some buildings in a couple of places. So, I mean, we're talking about some very serious storm energy that's coming through. These hailstones were also coming down as well. That were rather large. And so people were definitely not like, I can just stand outside in the rain. No, this is the kind of storm where you go inside, because the hailstones that are coming down are like golf balls. They're huge. So anyway, the storm comes through, blows through, it's gone. And then the soldiers go through their dress rehearsal, their dress parade. And around 7 that evening, the Sea Wing's whistle blew to alert its passengers to come back to the landing for the return trip back west. As the Sea Wing prepared to depart the dock at Lake City, Mrs. Weathern put her youngest son, Pearlie, to sleep in the captain's quarters, and then settled herself into a rocking chair just outside the door. Her other son, Roy, was kind of standing at the railing at the front of the ship, just kind of, doing what you do as a little kid. You stand at the railing, you look over, you start looking in the water for like fish or whatever else that you can see. The rest of the crew set to work getting ready to depart, despite the rough waves on Lake Pepin. At that time, I mean, that one storm had departed, but it was still not really looking good. It looked like it might get hit again. I mean, you're having a very stormy weather, and it's kind of a lull. On board, it's busy enough, but the Washington Street landing where the boat was docked was teeming with people. Some of them passengers from earlier waiting to board, some who hadn't come on the morning trip from Diamond Bluff but were taking the Sea Wing back, and some who were rubbernecking what was starting to look like a dangerous situation. The clouds above were still ominous and dark, and the surface of the lake writhed like a toddler throwing a tantrum. When the storm hit Camp Lakeview, people could see the lake with these like 8 to 6 feet waves just pounding the shore. That's how much wind was hitting that lake and the water. It was just absolutely dangerous. Now you're back, about to get back on this boat, and the water on the lake is still rough. I imagine the boat's kind of rocking back and forth, and the barge is rocking back and forth. Maybe there's a little creaking going on, some bumping, a little loud noises, and you're just looking at this thinking, do I really want to get on that thing? With the Sea Wing lying as low as it did in the water, some of those hanging out nearby expressed their concerns to the departing passengers. Hey, maybe you want to hold off on going home until a little later? That Sea Wing's not looking too steady. A few people agreed, and they stepped back. They could always take the train back or stay in the Lion Hotel in Lake City and head home the next day. There's always another option, and it seemed a lot safer than going on the ship. Captain Weathern, meanwhile, decided to hold off for another hour until 8 to see if the storm would die down. Unfortunately, it really did no such thing. It didn't go all the way off, basically. It kind of like... It was like a dimmer switch. It went down a little bit, just enough to kind of trick him into thinking, okay, we should be okay. And it wasn't all the way off. I mean, the water's still, the winds are gusting, the waters are still splashing around and making the two boats unsteady. The Sea Wing pulled away from Washington Street Landing at 8:15, headed toward the west with 215 people on board. Now, Captain Weathern would later say that there were 175 people on board. There were more than that. When they did the kind of the head count later on, they realized that the Sea Wing was carrying way more than what its kind of limit was in terms of carrying passengers. It was overloaded. Not like 100 people, but maybe like 30, 40 people, even with the Jim Grants there to take some of the pressure off. In fact, some people actually jumped onto the Jim Grant figuring that it would be more steady. The boat plowed through the rough waves as best it could, with some people on the Sea Wing beginning to sense that something wicked this way might be coming again. One passenger, Charlie Seawall, decided it wasn't worth the risk. So he calls out, "Goodbye, boys!" And then he just jumps over the side of, the Jim Grant or Sea Wing or whichever one that he was on at the time, and he starts swimming back to shore. That's some... that takes some courage right there, especially with the water being the way that it was. Before leaving the landing, men working on other ships at the landing gave Captain Weathern a bit of advice. If he was going to steer the ship out of the lake, out onto the lake, he needed to stick close to the southern shoreline. But instead, as he rounded Central Point, Central Point looks a lot like if you took a square of land or a little bit off shape square rectangle of land and just kind of attached it to the shoreline. So it would be a straight shoreline, but you have Central Point that you have to go around. He rounds Central Point and another piece of land extending out onto the lake. This one really is a point. Weathern decided the recommendation to stick to the shoreline was a good one, but instead of steering nearer to the Minnesota side, he headed the Sea Wing across the lake toward the other side, the Wisconsin side, on the north. So now he's out in the middle of the lake, basically, which is probably not a good place to be. Almost definitely not a good place to be, because the weather is starting to get worse. It's getting dark. It's getting stormy. It's stormier. It's getting windier. It's, just getting very, very difficult to see where you're going and to handle this ship. And it's not good. The winds were fierce, and at one point not long into their return trip, Captain Weathern spotted a strong gust coming off the southern coast to their left. So as any experienced seaman would do, he turned the Sea Wing straight into the wind, despite the waves being a good 6 to 8 feet high, just like they had been when people were still at Camp Lakeview. Now, if you've ever seen the movie The Poseidon Adventure, which is one of my favorite movies, and I mean the one from the 70s, it's great. If a big wave is coming at your ship, what you don't want is for your ship to be taking that on the port or starboard sides. It will knock you right over in the worst case scenario. You know, if you're fortunate, it doesn't do that, but the Poseidon Adventure is based on a novel that was where the author was inspired by a true event, or something like this actually kind of happened. It nearly knocked a ship over, a rogue wave. And so what you don't want to do is take that on the side. You want to go head first into that. Captain Weathern wanted to be staring directly into the wind, so when whatever was oncoming wave did hit them, they could more easily ride over it, like in the movie The Perfect Storm. I say that, okay? So maybe not exactly like The Perfect Storm, considering how that movie ends. If you have never seen it, it ends badly. But you get my drift. So about that time, nearly all of the 57 women and the children on the Sea Wing rushed into the cabin. It's storming, it's terrible out. They decide, I need shelter, and they go in there. They did so of their own accord. According to some reports, according to others, Captain Weathern ordered them inside. Either way, the cabin was far from the safest place to be when a huge wave approached the Sea Wing at the bow. Now, at this point, there may be other more experienced seamen who would have told their passengers to put on life belts just in case. And the ship did have life belts. It had life belts, it had rafts, it had all kinds of safety things. But nobody did that. And nobody, it seems, kind of grabbed for those things. I didn't really see any reference to, them being handed out or anything like that. So it really was a matter of people kind of, I think, thinking, okay, we'll just, we'll push on and we'll get through this. Now, if you've never seen The Perfect Storm, the climax of the movie, which is based on the true story of the loss of the Andrea Gale in a deadly Atlantic storm in 1991, features the fishing boat in question attempting to drive straight up a massive wave, which looks like a mountain compared to the Andrea Gale. In fact, the image itself was on all the posters. It was on everything. This tiny fishing boat pointing upward as it tries to crest a wave at a nearly 90-degree angle. And it goes over a 90-degree angle at one point, which is how the movie ends. I'm not ruining anything for you. I already told you the ship was lost. A steam paddle boat and an Atlantic fishing vessel are two entirely different creatures, though, in particular when it comes to their hulls and their shape. The Andrea Gale, it has this kind of, narrow, bottom, the way it's supposed to, and it kind of cut through the water a little better. Maybe the Andrea Gale could have crested that wave, but no one will ever know for sure because the boat was lost at sea. But the Sea Wing was essentially flat-bottomed. It's not meant to go on waves like this. It's not meant to ride on like whitewater, it's not whitewater rafting. This is just a paddle boat. So it went up on the wave, which struck it like a 4x4 or 2x4, like a flat piece of wood, attempting to live out its dream as a surfboard at a 45-degree angle. This just wasn't going to work out, no matter how good a Captain Weather might have been. And when this wave comes up under the boat, this Sea Wing takes this gust of wind and this water and just right, and it capsizes. It flips onto its side. It sort of gets unsteady a little bit, and then it just flops over. And it starts rolling. Some accounts I've seen said it rolled a couple of times. Some I've seen said it rolled just the once, but the matter of the fact is that it rolled down, and that the pilot house ended up on the bottom, and the hull was on the top. So what you have is anybody who was outside of the cabin, outside of the pilot house, who was outside of it all, was dumped into the river. And anybody else who was inside of the cabin or inside of the pilot house was now trapped inside a place that was enclosed and is filling with water. This includes Captain Weathern. Captain Weathern was in the pilot house. So survivors were being unceremoniously dumped into the lake. They're scrambling to find something to grab onto. A few survivors managed to pull themselves up onto the hull of the Sea Wing. Still others clung to whatever bit of wreckage they managed to float past. But some industrious survivors decided to take a chance and swim for the shoreline, powering through the water as best they could with lightning crashing overhead and water thrashing about. There's hailstones falling. I mean, it's just absolute chaos. And they start swimming toward the south because Central Point is very close. That's the closest to them right now. Inside the cabin where so many women and children had taken cover from the storm, there was no escape. They were trapped within the capsized ship, hopefully dying before they could suffer in terror for too long. The Sea Wing, meanwhile, followed the flow of the river with it and its discarded contents floating eastward. Captain Weathern, who'd been in the pilot house atop the Sea Wing, soon found himself stuck underwater when the boat flipped. Placing his feet against the wheel, he pushed at the glass of the window until it broke. Now free, he swam up and joined others on the overturned hull of the Sea Wing. He's also yelling for his wife and his two sons. You know, he's yelling their names, he's yelling to try and find them, and he's not hearing anything. But he and the other 24 people or so who were on the hull at the time were soon unceremoniously dumped into the river when the ship rotated once again. It kind of ends up tilted on the side. You can see in pictures later on that it looks like it's on its starboard side, but also like the pilot house is sort of making it at an angle, so the hull is up a little bit, but also that port side is out. As for the Jim Grant, accounts vary on whether the ropes connecting the barge to the Sea Wing were ordered to be cut by the crew or snapped by the force of the storm toying with the larger steamboat. Some accounts say they were cut. Captain Weathern changed his story. At one point he said they broke. On one point he said they were cut. It really... I'm not sure if it really matters because one way or another, those two separated. Captain Weathern theorized that if the barge was still attached to the steamboat, it wouldn't have rolled. That may have been, that may not have been, but what happened is what happened, and the Jim Grant kind of is pulled away from the steamboat. Either way, you've got passengers falling into the lake from the steamboat, the barge as well, because a couple of them are so disrupted and just kind of knocked overboard. So there are some people who fall off it, but for the rest of them, you're just kind of hanging on to this barge, and rain's pouring down, you're clutching this, and you're just trying to not, hoping that this doesn't capsize as well. The barge starts floating back on down the lake in the direction of Lake City. Central Point was closer, and it's also kind of in the way. And as soon as they could see it, some of those on board the barge scrambled over the sidewalls and onto the shore. So they're, as soon as they're close enough to see the shoreline, they're just like, that's it. They get out and they go to the safety of land. The Sea Wing would finally stop moving when it reached Central Point as well. Here, the pilot house atop the Sea Wing, now at the bottom of the ship, got caught on the lake bed. The paddle boat stuck and tipped to port, with those who'd been riding the ship's hull dumped into the lake. Here, at least, the water was shallow enough for the survivors who were still attached or anything like that to swim only a short distance before treading water to the shoreline. Given the Sea Wing's proximity to the southern part of the lake, it was closer to reach the land and head the few miles or so to Lake City. Some of those who'd already climbed off the Jim Grant raced the couple of miles to Lake City to get others to come help. They're bedraggled, they're soaking wet, they've, been struggling to hold on or to swim or whatever, and now they've got to run a couple of miles to get to Lake City and get some help from the other people on the ship. As where was I? Yes, survivor Henry Maybe ran off to the fire hall in Lake City and yanked on the alarm bell to tell everybody there was something happening. This got people, together. They start spreading the story. Hey, the Sea Wing has capsized and they need help. So people start loading into smaller boats, into skiffs, and heading out to the scene of the wreck, where dozens of people were still struggling to stay up in the water, and a lot of people were already drowned. Plenty of people hurried to save the living, but the National Guard rushed to the site to retrieve the dead. As night fell, they hurried to Central Point and gathered the bodies on the shores they'd washed up on. The regiment's surgeon, Major Fitzgerald, took charge of the recovery process, organizing the men who would take out of the lake the very same people who only hours earlier had cheerfully watched them go through their dress parade. 98 people lost their lives when the Sea Wing capsized during a storm on Lake Pepin on July 13th, 1890. Only 7 of the 57 women on board survived, whether it be because they were trapped in the Sea Wing's cabin or because they were struggling to swim if light, summer dresses in a storm-stirred lake which wasn't about to just let them reach shore. You try swimming with a bunch of fabric around your legs. Not easy. Of the towns affected by the wreck, Red Wing suffered the greatest losses, with 67 of the dead needing to be brought home. 44 of those victims were buried on the same day in 3 separate cemeteries, making for a somber and busy day. In a town of only 6,000 people, it was more likely that every single person in town either was related to or knew someone who died on the Sea Wing. With the storm ending after about half an hour, the priority soon became recovering the bodies of everyone who'd been lost on the Sea Wing. Not everybody washed up on shore. A lot of people they started floating down the river. Some of them were alive and clinging to stuff and floating down the river, but some of them were deceased and their bodies were following the flow of the river. Those who were within the boat's cabin when it flipped were stuck in a place where the volunteers who participated in the recovery operation had the small blessing of having those bodies contained. It was simply a matter of pulling them out one after another. Those involved in the rescue and recovery processes broke open the side of the cabin to make a hole they could remove the tangled bodies of women and children through. Now, I did see a couple of mentions that there were some people who were still alive in the cabin, and I can't imagine how nightmarish that might have been to be in that situation and be surrounded by people who were drowning, and maybe there's a little gap where there's some air that you've managed to luck out and be stuck in. Once they were out, the dead would be transferred to the steamer Ethel Howard to be returned to Red Wing the next morning. But plenty of people had been standing on the boat's deck when it flipped, dumping them into the lake. Dressed in their finest for a nice day out, most weren't equipped for a swim, and especially one during a fierce storm pitching the waters of Lake Pepin to and fro. But there was, again, a small blessing. Given the location of the sinking paired with the layout of the southern coastline of the lake, any bodies pulled out of the water of the wreck were more than likely to wash ashore on Central Point, or maybe to wash ashore on Lake City, near Lake City. They were in a position that a lot of them did wash ashore. National Guardsmen had headed over from Central Point, like I mentioned earlier, to get those drowned bodies off the shoreline. They would be at Central Point and near the shore for the next 4 days, attempting to gather and account for each of the 40 missing from the Sea Wing. They would fire cannons into the water and throw dynamite into the lake to stir up any bodies which might have sunk beneath the waves. And within 4 days, I believe they had accounted for everyone. It was easy enough to find someone to point the finger at when searching for someone to blame for the wreck of the Sea Wing. Captain David Weathern had been in charge, and he was still alive, so on that level, at least there might be justice. And in any other instance, it probably would have been cathartic for the families of the victims to throw proverbial stones Captain Weathern's way. But while Captain Weathern and his eldest son Roy returned to shore, his wife Nellie and their younger son Pearlie had not. He had lost loved ones as well, and was not just racked with the same grief as everyone else, but guilt as well. For some, those losses were punishment enough, but only for some. There were still some people who were angry and wanted him to be punished. On July 20th, official hearings into what caused the Sea Wing to wreck opened in St. Paul, a few dozen miles upriver. The hearings would last a week, examining the evidence and listening to witness testimony. When the hearings were complete, the report on their findings stated that the Sea Wing's crew were found not to have the proper licenses, and the Sea Wing carried more passengers than it should. While the federal investigation could have brought Captain Weathern to trial for his actions on July 13th, they didn't. There was one point where there was concern for Captain Weathern's safety from the families of the victims, and he was actually placed in prison so that they could keep an eye on him. But he was found by the investigators to be not skilled enough as a captain to pilot the ship under the conditions on Lake Pepin that day. Everything seemed to boil down to a simple question. Why in heaven's name would Captain Weathern attempt to return upriver with the weather as wild as it was and so far from the shoreline? Of course, the question could also be extended to the passengers. I'm not victim blaming. I'm just saying that that is something during the investigation that people might ask as well. Why did those people even get on the boat in the first place? Why did so many get on? It wasn't a requirement to return to the Sea Wing, and many didn't. They could always take a train or a later boat and stay overnight in Lake City. But still, not only did nearly all of the original passengers board the Sea Wing that evening, so too did some passengers who just purchased tickets and were taking the ride back to Red Wing or Trenton or Diamond Bluff, another town. They were just taking that one-way trip instead of the round trip. It's easy to sit here and say that curled up under a warm blanket at home, but the passengers had had quite the eventful day. Any day trip can be tiresome, but it had been a warm and muggy day, which always drags you down. Then at Camp Lakeview, people ran here and there, searching for a safe place to shelter from the passing storm. The passengers were probably just thinking when they heard the ship's bell, "Oh, thank God, I am so tired, I cannot wait to go home, get changed, and go to bed." And if the ride home was a little rough and bumpy, so be it. With his pilot's license taken away for the next 3 years, Captain David Weathern returned home to raise his only living son, at first alone and later with his second wife. He remained in good standing in the area for the most part, although some people were understandably upset. The urge to find someone to blame when something like this happens is a way for you to redirect your anger and your grief at a person, at somebody who's responsible. If you can't do that, it can get really difficult, and those emotions can get stifled inside of you, and it's just not good. And so a lot of people were very eager to say, yeah, that guy was the captain, and that boat flipped over, and it's his fault for going out in the first place. But his life in Diamond Bluff as an upstanding citizen continued. He was on the town's board and was its chairman and its treasurer. He joined fraternal organizations and kept running his business. For the most part, his life didn't change. Now, obviously, he lost his wife and son, but his status in the community was still there. He had losses, and he also had people who kind of forgave him for what had happened, or at least were able to live with the fact that he had been at the wheel when the Sea Wing capsized. As for the Sea Wing, it and the Jim Grant were towed back to Diamond Bluff 2 weeks after the disaster. The Jim Grant was fine. I did see pictures of it, and I believe it looked like the roof had been ripped off, so I don't know if that had come off in the storm or if they had taken that off so they could more easily use it in the rescue and recovery efforts. But it really just needed that replaced. I mean, as a barge, it worked fine. But the Sea Wing needed a lot of work if it wanted to be used again, if it needed to be rebuilt once more. So after David Weathern had the Sea Wing back in working order, she ended up with a new home base in St. Paul, continuing to work the river for another 10 years. At that point, it was essentially stripped for parts, with the pilot house turned into a hen house. They took out the motor and put it in like a motorboat or something along those lines. But it was basically like, we have all these parts that we can still use. Let's put them into other vessels. In 1990, the Goodhue County Historical Society installed a memorial marker for those lost in the Sea Wing sinking in Levee Park in Red Wing, Minnesota, within only 50 feet or so of the Mississippi River's edge. Now, I say marker. It's not like one of those blue markers that you see on the side of the road that says, here, is where this famous person is from, or that sort of thing. The marker consists of a pair of metal panels, which are on a stone base or like a marble base right in front of you. You can walk right up to them and they're right in front of you for, to read. They tell the story of the Sea Wing on one panel, and then another which lists the names of the 98 victims who lost their lives. The Goodhue County History Center in Red Wing is also supposedly haunted by the victims of those who drowned on the Sea Wing, at least according to the story that I watched. The center houses artifacts from the sinking, including the ship's bell, one of its life vests, and a cello used by the band, or at least pieces of the cello. There's like the back, and there's the neck of the cello. At least I think it's a cello. I am not somebody to be correctly naming classical instruments, but yeah. In a KSTP story right before Halloween several years ago, a ghost hunter recorded what sounded like a young girl saying Sophie. It's actually really clear for ghost recordings, which is kind of hilarious. I think you all know by now I don't believe in ghosts, but if I were going to haunt somewhere, I'm pretty sure a history museum would be right up my alley. Yeah, so that is the story of the Sea Wing. It is really interesting. I'd never heard of it before, and it is one of the deadliest maritime disasters in this country, and I had never heard of it. So that was really cool to be able to find out about a new disaster. I always love finding out about new disasters. It's great. Speaking of new disasters, how's everybody doing? How's everybody been this month? Oh, sweet mother of mercy. I hope you all have been doing well, or at least have been doing what you can to feel better. I skipped Thanksgiving so that I would feel better. That was, I didn't exactly skip Thanksgiving. I have worked the last 6 Thanksgivings at dog camp, so this was no exception. I went to dog camp. I stayed there until 6 that night. I was there from I think 11 o'clock until 6, editing photos, and then I came home. I made some broccoli and cheese tater tots. I took a nap with Professor, and then I went into my bedroom and I just kind of hung out and played some games on my phone and did some, stuff. I just kind of laid back, and it was great. It was relaxing, and I didn't have to talk to anyone. It was wonderful. Professor didn't say anything offensive. It was great. There is one particular thing on my request list that I'm doing next. Some of you know what it is. Some of you don't, but it is timely, and I was really going to try to do it this month, but mentally the last few weeks have been very hard for some of us, including me. I spent that particular week, which I think we know which week I'm talking about, very stoned. Oh boy, was I stoned. I was so stoned. I went through an entire bag of gummies. I was just stoned. And then when I started feeling better, I took another one. And then I was starting feeling more sober. I take another one. And it was just, I was fortunate enough that I was off for most of that week. So for, I think it was, 5 straight days of just taking a gummy and going back to bed. Taking a gummy and going back to bed. Taking a gummy and going back to bed. Talk about depression hitting you hard. It smacked me in the face. The next time that I talked to my therapist, I was like, "Are you okay? Do you need some gummies? How's your week been? How's your 2 weeks been?" So there's that. I just, like I said, earlier, if you feel like you are having a difficult time right now, you are under no obligation to talk to anyone or to do anything that makes you feel uncomfortable. And I mean that in every sense of the word. Like, if anybody in your life is making you uncomfortable or upsetting you or is being cruel to you, you don't have to talk to them. Even if you're related, you don't have to talk. I'm not talking to some of my relatives right now or anymore. Now, I know there's a lot of people, and I said this on my personal TikTok a couple of days ago, and it actually went a little viral, which is hilarious. But somebody asked if the election had gone the other way, would everybody who's breaking off friendships right now still be breaking them off? And I said in response to that, why did you think we were friends before? I am not friends with people who are cruel to others. If somebody is being cruel to other people and disrespectful and ignorant of what affects them, I step back from them. I am not friends with those people, and I don't have to be. It doesn't mean that I'm in an echo chamber because I'm friends with people I actually like. And the same goes for anybody else. It does not mean that you're in an echo chamber because you like to be around people that you actually like to be around, and not people who are cruel and say mean things or say problematic things at the very least. And so, you do not have to be friends with anybody. You do not have to be family with anybody. You can make the decisions on that. If somebody is a problem, you don't have to have to have a relationship with them anymore. You really don't. If it is more healthy for you to step back and say no, then do that. And it might be hard, and you may feel a kind of a social pressure, a personal pressure to stay in that sort of relationship, but you don't have to. Who says you have to? Nobody says you have to. You may feel guilt-tripped into that sort of thing, but you really don't have to. You are your own person, and you have to take care of yourself. It's like when a plane is crashing, and you're on it with your child or with somebody else. The first thing that you do if something like that happens is put the mask on yourself first and then help others, because you need to take care of your health so that you can help others. And if you are not feeling healthy, whether it's mentally, physically, emotionally, whatever, in the presence of someone, you can step back from that. You do not have to stay in a relationship like that. You don't. Nobody says you do. There are 8 billion people in the world. You can make new relationships and new friends and new family. Found family is great. I have people I would argue are like sisters to me that I have never met. I have one person who is a friend of mine who lives in the DC area. I have never met her face to face. I have never met her face to face, but I practically consider her a sister. She has been my friend for years and years and years, and she's always supportive, and she always fights the good fight, and she's always, she's strong, she's smart, she's fantastic. I love her to pieces, and I have never met her face to face. I know her from social media, from Facebook. Like, every single time I go to a new social media, there she is. I don't want to mispronounce her name. Her Mara. I have to remind myself because I always see her name. It's like when you read a word and you don't know how to pronounce it, and so you pronounce it the way that you think it's pronounced. And so every time I see her name, I think it's Mara, and I have to keep reminding myself, no, it's Mara. Her name is Mara. Mara. Yeah. But anyway, she's practically family. If I ever was in a desperate situation and I was in that area, I would feel perfectly safe sending her a message and saying, hey, can I go to your house? Can I come over? Can I talk to you? Something. Can I call you on the phone? Like, if I was in desperate need of someone to help me and I was in DC, or in, the Maryland area or wherever, closer to where she is personally, I would go to there, and I would, I'd call her and say, hey. And that is, we make relationships like this all the time. We make close friendships like this all the time. But there are a lot of times that we have relationships with people that we have to have with them. Like at work. There are certain people at work I don't want to talk to anymore. And I'm talking to them as an obligation. I don't have the advantage of being able to say, I don't want to talk to you anymore, and we just have to continue working together without communicating. I can't do that. And so I have to keep talking to them. And I'm keeping it to a bare minimum because right now I just can't talk to them. I really can't. And when there are people who are saying, well, why are you breaking off friendships? Why would you do it now? A lot of us already broke off friendships because of all of this. And so this is nothing new. There just seem to be a lot of people who don't understand that if I don't feel safe with you, I can't be friends with you. And that is a very large part of what's happening right now. It is the same with staring at the sea wing and seeing it on, going up and down on 6 foot, 8 foot waves and going, do I get on that boat? No, you don't get on the boat. Don't get on the boat. Stay on the shore. Go to the hotel. Get yourself a room. Just, stay there. Do not get on the boat. It's okay. There's a safe place that you can go. And there are also a lot of people who, will criticize, well, you need conflict in your life. No, you don't need conflict in your life. You don't. You don't need conflict. You can just step back from that. If it's not healthy for you, if it doesn't feel good, if it's not something that you can go through. I always think of that saying, God never gives you more than you can handle. Oh, God does that all the time. Like, I don't believe in God personally, but that's kind of like if you read any sort of religious text, God or Allah or however you refer to your God or gods or whatever, they all give you difficult things to live through on occasion. Life can't be a paradise. It can't. But on the same token, as an atheist, I don't have to put myself through, a difficult life if I don't have to. There are aspects of my life that I have to go through that are difficult. I have to have 2 jobs. I have to put out episodes of the podcast when I need money. I have to do certain things that I was sitting around the other day because thinking about what I'm going to do for the next 2 weeks because I don't have to work at dog camp. It's not busy. And as a seasonal worker, I don't have to work there, but I need money. So I was debating, well, maybe I should, with Christmas coming up and everything like that, maybe I should work, do DoorDash or Uber or something for 2 weeks. And I was like, wait, why am I even, this is, no, I can't handle that. I just can't. And so I'm not going to. I'm going to stay home and I'm going to work on the podcast. And that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm choosing to do for my better health. I am going to work tonight at my weekend job, but I am going to take most of tomorrow night off. I'm actually, I have 9 hours of vacation and I'm taking 9 hours. So I'm only going to be there for 3 hours, which just seems ridiculous, but I have to go. So I'm going to go there for the 3 hours and I am going to I'm going to do what I have to do, and then I'm going to come home early and clean my apartment because it desperately needs it. I was thinking of sending my dog to camp for the 2 weeks to kind of get him out and get him some fresh air and give us both a break from each other because this month has been very difficult and he hasn't been able to go to camp. And I think he needs to lose a little weight personally, but also I think it's really imperative that we all do what we can for now and possibly for the next 4 years, if longer, to do whatever is necessary to keep ourselves from having a breakdown or having our mental health negatively impacted by everything that is going on around us. And if that means, you have to go, you have to go into another room for 5 minutes to just have a breather, or do the version of that you do at work, which for most people, I assume is the same as me, which is I have to go to the bathroom. And then you go sit in the stall and you don't go to the bathroom. You just, play a game for 5 minutes or something, anything to kind of bring down your anxiety. It's going to be really important for us to be healthy and safe and take care of one another and be as good as we can, and to be strong and to be kind, as kind as we can manage at all times, because it's the only way that we can deal with what's going on. It's the only way. I mean, if you need to get angry and you need to get upset at something and you need to scream, there's pillows for that. You can come in your house and just scream at the top of your lungs. I mean, I would probably warn a neighbor just so they know that nobody's getting murdered. But, if you need to have just that cathartic moment, I'm sure there's ways that you can get that out. I've got a punching bag around here and it's going in my bedroom soon because I need something that I can just hit and hit and hit and hit. So, yeah. All right. Well, this episode's done and I am going to finish up and post it and take a nap. Okay. Thank you guys so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe.